This is the second narrated PowerPoint for Module 4 on Roots of Reform. In the previous PowerPoint, we looked at the structure of Roots of Reform and also the focus of the document. In this second PowerPoint, we're going to look at one of the three contexts presented in Roots of Reform, the political context. And the purpose of the PowerPoints is not to provide you with a lengthy lecture, but rather to serve as an advance organizer for your reading, because Roots of Reform is a dense document and requires close reading and rereading. So again, in this PowerPoint, we're just going to look at the political context. In the political context, we go back to 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected president, and education policy changed to a more conservative approach. We moved from equity to excellence, standards of performance, and individual competition. We moved from needs and access to ability, selectivity, and minimum entrance standards. We moved from social and welfare concerns to parental choice and privatization. And we moved from federal interests and initiatives to state and local interests and initiatives. The assumptions behind these policy changes actually went from assumptions to aphorisms. So with any reform movement, it's important to look at the different perspectives. In Roots of Reform, if you look at the overview, you will see that each context is broken up into sections, and the assumptions come under either the conservative view or the reform view. So let's go to political context. The three sections that are in political context are the purposes of schooling, conditions to stimulate achievement, and external resources and control. Also in Module 4, in Canvas, you will see that there are some articles to read, and the purpose of having these articles available to you is for you to read them and reflect upon which assumptions are in play with these articles. So under purposes of schooling, there are two ideas: meritocracy versus universality, and instrumentality versus entitlement. In meritocracy and universality, under the conservative view, the purpose of schooling in a democracy is to allow children and youth to progress and develop on the basis of their own ability and talent. That is meritocracy. Under the reform view, the purpose of schooling in a democracy is to extend the benefits of the society to all children and youth by preparing them to access those benefits. We're also going to be asking you to look at your own vision, mission, and value statement and consider which of these assumptions are in play when you develop those statements for your office or school. Also under the purposes of schooling is instrumentality versus entitlement. Under the conservative view, the test of the efficacy of an education system is its instrumental contribution to the goals of society. For example, is the school preparing its students for careers that will advance society and support the goals of society? Under the reform view, the test of the efficacy of an education system is the extent to which it meets the entitlement of all children to access the benefits of their society. And so when you read the article on Alice Ott, think about this particular section, instrumentality versus entitlement, and what is in play in that particular article. Okay, the second section under political context is conditions to stimulate achievement. And again, there are two sections there. Individual responsibility versus institutional responsiveness, and competition and standards versus cooperation and support. So, under individual responsibility versus institutional responsiveness, the conservative view states that achievement in school rests predominantly in the hands of the individual student, where we think of students who, let's say, are underserved. How do they advance? And the idea of pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps come to mind, that an individual who really wants to achieve will do whatever is necessary. And it really doesn't depend on any level playing field. All of the resources are there for everyone, even though all students aren't at the same starting point. The reform view states that individual achievement in school is influenced markedly by the adjustment of the school to the student client. And again, I would call your attention to the article on Alice Ott, and also possibly the Job Corps article. Under competition and standards versus cooperation and support, under the conservative view, it states that educational achievement is enhanced by high standards, competition, and comparative assessment of students, schools, and school districts. So when we think about No Child Left Behind and the emphasis on standards, this was certainly an emphasis in Maryland's own Race to the Top application, that all students must meet high standards. And also in our legislation, the emphasis on assessments, particularly comparative assessments. And when you look at the Every Student Succeeds Act, you will see that in many cases, the idea of standards, that standards can be developed by the state or district, but they do have to align to college and career readiness. So, again, when you're reading the information on the Every Student Succeeds Act, you will certainly see, again, standards and assessments. Under the reform view, it states that educational achievement is enhanced by conditions of cooperation that reflect trust, confidence, support, and challenge among and between teachers and learners. And again, think about the emphasis on cooperative learning, wraparound services that have been in place in schools for the last decade. And then the third area under political context is external resources and control. And again, there are two sections: stable versus increased investments, and bankruptcy versus viability. So under stable versus increased investments, under the conservative view, it states that additional resource investments in public education will not increase system performance and are unnecessary to effect and sustain major reform in schools. And again, one of the articles you might want to think about in terms of these assumptions would be the merit, not money article. Under the reform view, it states that additional resource investments in public education will increase system performance and will affect the rate and scope of major reform in schools. And again, just to think about organizations that are not educational organizations, how many of them would say that we don't need additional investments to increase our performance or increase our viability? Again, just to think about. And then the second area is bankruptcy versus viability. And under the conservative view, and this is certainly something we have been dealing with for the last several years, it states that the viability of the American public school system is so low that external agencies must design and control the needed reform. We certainly see this in the current Department of Education with the emphasis on privatization, charters, and schools for profit. Under the reform view, it states that the viability of the American public school system is exhibited by current performance in relation to past performance and by international comparisons of student achievement. And again, when you read in Roots of Reform, you'll see that the authors suggest that if you compare like populations in the United States with those of foreign countries, our results are pretty good. What skews our results is that, again, in the United States, the expectation is that we educate every child to his or her highest potential. And it certainly presents more challenges. So that is the overview of the political context. One other article I might draw your attention to is the one about Frederick County repealing its English-only legislation. And again, thinking about that under the purposes of schooling, perhaps instrumentality versus entitlement, where the idea is that the goals of society, the school system's purpose is to advance the goals of society, and think about that in terms of enforcing a one language approach. So the next PowerPoint will be on the social context of schooling.